strange kind of intermediate stage that we're all in, really. It's quite difficult to get your arms around where we are in this journey, as we say, journey to rejoin. And I think it's true for many of the for Europe groups around the country. We're all feeling a bit in between, in all sorts of senses, that we have two major political parties, or even a third, the Lib Dems, who are not quite sure that they're brave enough, in the case of Labour, and even a bit in the Lib Dems, not quite brave enough to sort of come out and say where they really are, but we're kind of hoping that they will, particularly if their party wins. All sorts of counter movements of one sort or another, politics very fractioned, very fragmented. So where we are. So as Jane said, I suppose the bad news in a way, there is some good news to come. The bad news is that it's, whatever view one takes, a long and complicated way ahead to whatever it is. If we want a rejoin or a join, I'll speak about that in a moment, it's a long and complicated way ahead. There is no easy, obvious path, whatever anybody says. It's not going to happen tomorrow, it's not going to happen in a year, whatever it is. So we have to be patient and ready to continue on the road that we've set ourselves on as Europeans. The good news is really what Jane was saying, which is that we are already kind of on the road in terms of the wider population. I have the figures here. So there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 opinion polls from various organisations in January and February. And they range, it's interesting, in terms of what people feel about whether it was good to be out or not good to be out. They range from, the lowest is 53% against 47, positive, up to the highest is 63 against 37. So the average is around 57 to 43, so it seems at the moment. So that's real progress, and if you chart the numbers back at these last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it's been a steady upward path. I think one of the questions, though, we have to ask ourselves is to what extent those who now see Brexit as a mistake are influenced not, as it were, by a longing to be back in the EU, but merely by the bad news of much of the economy and other factors that have been going on, irrespective, as it were, of Brexit. So I think we have to be pleased about those numbers, because obviously it's good, but we equally have to sort of lay them off, discount them to a certain extent, because undoubtedly all sorts of other non-EU, non-Brexit factors will be in there somewhere. So yes, good news, but let's not be naive about why it is that people think something in the past was a mistake, which it was. Let's be clear about that. As Jane said, I started this journey of ours back in 1973, when Tessa and I went to live in Brussels, when Britain and Ireland and Denmark joined up with that first expansion of the EU. And I can well remember taking the exam, do you believe, a civil service type exam in the Alexandra Palace. I don't remember, there were hundreds of people sitting at those old-fashioned desks having to write various clever answers to some rather silly questions about why this and why that and why the other. And then landing up in the Berlaymont building, pre-asbestos, because for a number of years it was all closed down because of asbestos, and working in that building. I have to say it was a fantastic privilege. I think Tessa and I would both say it in all sorts of different ways, to be part of a whole, as we saw it and as I still see it, a whole movement which moved Europe away from what had been happening not only in the Second War, but in the First War, and all the way back through all those European wars and other disasters caused by the nationalism nationalisms and the other political movements, ideological movements that Europe gave rise to. And working with people of all those nationalities, not to say there weren't struggles and issues and complications and so on, of course there were, a really positive experience which has remained with me. And when I, as one does, come across people who sort of speak about the Commission, even if they understood what the Commission was, as being some vast, gigantic bureaucracy of hundreds of thousands of people shoveling bits of paper around, I do take some delight in being able to say, well, actually I was there and I have been back since, and it's actually a smaller number of people than our entire Ministry, well, it's now called DEFRA, Ministry of Agriculture, employs. So it was a good time, and before I go on to further things to say, one of the things I think we have to hold on to is the vision. So often the debate is around economics and GDP and trade figures and free trade and all those things, all very important, but actually, in a way, even more now with what's going on in Ukraine and the Balkans and elsewhere, now it's even more important that we hang on to this vision of Europe. Don't get caught up, though we have to debate it and have the figures at our fingertips, not get caught up in thinking this is just about economics or regulations or free trade or whatever. Yes, those may well be means to an end, they may be necessary, they are, but the core vision, which I think we didn't put across successfully in the Brexit referendum debate, must remain that this is an important way for peace and prosperity across now the much wider Europe that we know. So I've got, I think, 4 points. Usually you're supposed to tell, in a good sermon, it's supposed to be 3 points, but actually I've got 4 points. I always like to do things slightly differently. So the first one is about this word rejoin, because we see it all the time. You know, rejoin is what we want, and of course, in a sense, that's right. But I kind of just want to question a bit whether that is actually a helpful way of thinking about where we're headed. Because when you think about it, to anything is to look backwards. It's to go back to where we were. It's kind of psychologically. So if we say rejoin, we think back to where we were, and that's where we want to be again. Of course, we do want to be back in the European Union, but rejoin, I think, is risky because it firstly looks us back. Secondly, it conjures up the Brexit debate, puts us back into that kind of context, which we're not in anymore. We're in a different place because it suggests in a real way that both the EU and ourselves and the other member states are in some sense where they were then. Well, actually, that's simply not the case, of course. We know, for example, that the political personalities who played such an important part at that time, I'm thinking particularly in Germany of Angela Merkel, but also of many others, they're not there anymore. We have Scholz, and we have a whole series of others, positive and negative. We have Orban now in that context. We have Tusk, glad to say, in Poland. So just at the level of personalities who do frame the debates, we're in a very different political era. But then, of course, we're also in a wildly different, what you might call macro-political context now than we were then. You only have to say the words of Russia and Ukraine to see just how very different the world now is than certainly at the time of Brexit, then probably we've seen it for a very long time. We look across the Atlantic and we see these extraordinarily dangerous and almost incredible things that a potentially future president of the United States is saying about possibly encouraging Russia to attack a NATO member country, i.e. an EU member country. So again there, the macro political dimension is very, very different from where we were those relatively few years ago. And China and the whole question about trade, whole issue of to what extent we have to be self-sufficient, that whole debate has shifted substantially. We have the rise of right-wing very nationalist parties. We have Wilders in the Netherlands, and similar rise of right-wing parties in a way, AFDs and so on, that they were around in those days, but they're now stronger than they were then. All of those things mean that we're now in, and are going to go on being in, a different context than we were in Brexit. And that's, again, why I think we have to be careful about the word rejoin, because we're moving to join into another type of context. And I could add, of course, that within the EU itself, its policies have moved on substantially. If you look at immigration, long-standing, difficult debate, it's in a different place it is now. The green package, it's in a very different place than it was when we left. Industrial policy, quite extraordinary, the change that has come about. Certainly when I was there, and for many, many years afterwards, the notion of state subsidizing its industries in order to be more self-sufficient against all the insecurities of supply chains was something that was really strongly worked against. Competition policy was, what do we have now? We have a policy which is around supply security, around making sure that our core industries are secure and safe from the kinds of disruptions that we saw certainly around Ukraine and Russia, but also around COVID, around China, around, dare I say it, now America. So all those policies, defence policy, has moved on. The great argument in Brexit, the great fear, so-called, that there was going to be a European army and that our defence armed forces were going to be subject to it. Well, it's not going to be like that, but certainly the idea of defence, particularly in the context of Russia and the Baltic and the Polish governments, have moved a long way towards the ideas of common defence policies, far further than where they were those years ago. So I think for all those kinds of reasons, the big context, the EU context, and of course in our own national context, things have changed. We may have, and will change, we may have, hopefully, speaking purely personally, we may have a different government next year, later this year maybe. We have a real disenchantment with politics. You saw that the turnout for the two by-elections yesterday, somewhere below 40%, disenchantment with politics, fragmentation in politics. Rising right-wing reform, successor to UKIP, got between, I think, 10 and 13% of the vote. Maybe we're heading towards different situations for Ireland and Scotland. So for all those kinds of reasons, I kind of want to think that it's better to speak about joining in a way than rejoining, because we have to be realistic about the different contexts that we're now going to be working in, and kind of realism as well as vision is critical to us. We have to hold together this great vision of our being able to be part of what is a grand peace project and the realities on the ground which have changed and will continue to change. So that's my first point. What do you think about that? Any thoughts before I go on to anything else? Yeah.
Can I just say that there is a great debate within the National Council of the European Movement at the moment about rejoin or join. And I think it's the Vice Chair of Oxford for Europe has written a very, very cogent article about why we should still use the word rejoin. It's not, and he argues that that is not implying going backwards, but we would be rejoining the European Union, even though it's moved on, if you see what I mean. And it's a very, very good argument, which I could put into the next newsletter, if people are interested in it. I think that these are debates that possibly they are important, but I don't think we're at that point in a way yet. We need to still be pointing out where Brexit's gone wrong.
Yeah, I of course we don't want to get bogged down in a debate about semantics. That's absolutely right. So the key point is key points are the ones I've tried to point out, which I'm sure the article will have said, is that the world is not the same as it was when we were forced to leave. And that's the realism point, isn't it? So yeah, no point in spending lots of time, I say, around the semantics of join, rejoin. I happen to think join is a better thing, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time tossing around, whether one or other is better. So I
think in a way, the way the world has changed makes it even more imperative that we rejoin or join.
Well, absolutely, and we can think of other words, no doubt, if we want to, but hang on to the core point. Whatever words we use, this is a completely new, or very substantially new environment that we're going to be operating in, and that's the heart of the matter. Yeah, Adrian.
Well, I was just going to say, sorry, back to your earlier point, perhaps we need to deconstruct a little bit more the reason why people voted to leave. And I was thinking a lot about that when you were flagging it up. For one thing, whether it's Karl Marx or Bill Clinton, is the economy stupid? That was part of it. And I think that does condition people's thinking, certainly if their livelihoods and their businesses collapse. And there's plenty of examples of that. Their values are ultimately, I think, I've thought a lot about this, are ultimately conditioned by that. The other one, of course, is the demographic, as you say quite rightly, the young people who are getting older but experiencing these bad things will change as the older people shrug off their mortal coils and all the rest of it.
Oh, speak for yourself.
Well, I know, yes, that's I'm still here. I mean, that's just two examples anyway. I'm thinking of how we need to think carefully about the demographic and why it's changing in our favour. I think it was something that Peter Hall was talking about years ago. He did some analysis of this right at the beginning, and he said, well, it's about 30% of people whose attitudes you won't change. But between 30 and 52%, there's quite a lot of wriggle room with people who might say, well, fair enough, we were sold a pulp, we were sold a load of lies about how good the economy was going to be and how many trade deals Liam Fox was going to get,
Sure.
and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the demographic thing is important, and I think the trend is still for younger people to be more pro, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket, because actually you find amongst the right-wing parties significant numbers of younger generation people. So I think it remains overarchingly valid, but it's not quite the surefire thing that we might have wished it to be, and that's one of the, I mean, both what you might call disaffected young people and young people who think that it's such a mess, everything, that actually what you need now is a more iron-fisted leadership model to hold it all together. That has a certain traction amongst a younger generation, which we kind of need to be aware of.
That's quite interesting, actually, because I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is relevant, but I've got the opportunity to say so. Do you think with the rise of the right in Europe is in any way associated with the exit of this country? Because it seems to me that the EU was an organisation where the concept of the nation state has become elusive. And by Brexit, we have retrenched and we have regained our borders. Do laugh if you want to. So there's this idea that if the Brits can do it, then other people can do it. And I just wonder if that's a possibility. It's not a question that needs to be answered here.
No.
Something that buzzes around my mind.
I mean, I would say just two brief reflections on that. I mean, one is, I think, the cultural world that Europe as a whole, and perhaps more widely, lives in, is now, it's been coming for a while, it's very fragmented. And the whole thing about identity and I am this, and we don't, there's very little cohesiveness, as it were. And so I think that's one of these underlying. I think the second reflection is that, of course, when you try to do things together, whether kind of as a family or a nation or an EU, it's much more complicated. It's much more complicated and more frustrating that when you try to align policies, regulations, ways of doing things, particularly when you're dealing with a number of states in this case that we are, it's more complicated, and there's always something human to think, oh, for goodness sake, let's just get on with it and do this. And that, I think, was behind the take back control kind of idea. Not in a big political sense, but just it's so complicated in our life, why don't we just get on with it and do it ourselves? And I think that's around on the wider European scale as well. Sorry, Fiona, then I'm going to go to my point too.
Yeah, just picking up on what Michael said, I've tended to see it the opposite way, actually. That some of the other countries that were perhaps toying with the idea of leaving have seen what a disaster it's been for us,
Yes.
and that movement has just died. Look at what happened to Britain, and the way they got divided and all the problems they're having for themselves. And I think any leaving the EU movement in other member states have really decreased as a result of us leaving.
I think that's true, although I would also put that down to the whole Russia-Ukraine issue, that I think there's been a real sense that is such an existential threat to Europe, as it were, that the sense of working together, whether it's EU or NATO, has become more obviously true, driven, of course, by the Baltics and by Poland as well. But counter to that, of course, you have the Orbáns, you have the previous Polish government, and now you have, what's his name, Vucic in Slovakia, who's been, and Meloni for a while in Italy. So you've got those counter movements which are playing to not quite let's leave the EU, but it's not the hottest thing that it's sometimes made. So you've got both strands around in a strongish kind of way, the polls are, the Eurobarometer polls about who supports EU are still strong and probably stronger. And I think part of that, maybe a reaction to Britain leaving. So I think if anything it's had a positive, I agree with Fiona, I think it's had a positive impact. Okay, I'm going to go on to my second point. Now this starts with a slightly sort of technical thing, which I've been sort of thinking about recently. So there's a lot of stuff goes on in business and elsewhere about theory of change. Phrase everybody knows, theory of change. What is your theory of change? What it means is you have a goal, and the question is, how do you get to it? So it says, if I do this, then that. If that, then I do the other, as I try to get towards what it is I'm trying to achieve. And it makes us question our assumptions about the world we live in, the context in which we're trying to achieve what we want to achieve, and it makes us plot, as it were, the kind of steps towards what it is we want to achieve. So it can be in a business, it wants to sell more this, but it has to have a theory of how consumers live their life, what do consumers respond to. And so you have to have a step type of process which says, if this, then that, if that, then the other. And that will lead me to the outcome that I want. And I think this is really quite an important challenge for us in the European movement. What is our theory of change? How do people, in the context of our desired outcomes, how do we get people to the point of wanting the kinds of things that we want? So what is our theory of change around people, whether they're leavers or remainers? What is our theory of change around politicians? What are the steps that need to be taken, as it were, to bring them to the point that they will, and so on. So what is our theory of change? And I want to put up one quite broad idea, and then a number of more individual ideas around this idea of what is our theory of change. Because unless we have a theory of change, and we know what our assumptions are behind it, then we may well be tilting at windmills. We may be trying to do something, absolutely have no effect, because it's based on assumptions that are simply not true about people's behaviour. So the first thing I wanted to say, the big general thing around that, is this whole thing about head and heart, So the old debate, I think, and it was often said in the referendum debate, was that our theory of change was that if we quoted enough economic and other types of reasons why we would be worse off if we left, that was a head thing. That was essentially a head thing. And frankly, it didn't work because there was always a counter number and there was always the project fear. And actually, we didn't win through our theory of change. If we quote enough reasons why our economy will suffer, then people will realize that it's a bad thing to do, and then they will vote to remain at the referendum. And as opposed to that, there were at least two heart arguments that were put forward by the Brexit campaign. One was around sovereignty. It's not a head argument. Absolutely not. You can demolish the sovereignty argument in 2 ticks just by quoting the NATO treaty. The sovereignty argument is a heart argument that can only be responded to by heart arguments. And the second one, of course, is immigration. It was a heart thing. You can quote whatever figures you like about. Goodness knows we know now the immigration figures are not exactly what was laid out before us in the referendum. But it was a heart argument, not a head argument. And I think that our theory of change as we move forward has to take account of the fact that most people operate out of their minds, if you like, are changed by their hearts, not by any number of facts, particularly GDP facts. So you can, for instance, all the so-called doppelganger studies which say this is what economies like the British economy, how they've proceeded since Brexit, and this is how the UK's won, and the answer is they're 4% better off GDP-wise than us. That's what they say. Show me a person who is actually going to change their mind, because if we had stayed in, we would have been 4% better off than we are now. It's not an argument that cuts through to anything. If you could say, if we joined tomorrow, you'd be 10,000 quid a person better off, well, maybe that would cut through, but you can't say that because it wouldn't be true. Do you see what I mean? This head and heart type thing, that's where I think we largely went wrong, and what I think is we're still doing it. I think most of when you read what the arguments are, many of them are head arguments still, that we're worse off by such an amount. We'd be better off by such an amount. Free trade and so on. So that's my first big point about thinking about a theory of change. What is it that moves people to come to a different perspective about these sets of issues. And I think we lost largely because we didn't have a theory of change of that, which took into account that real aspect of the way people will change their hearts. So what are the big heart issues now, as it were, as we go forward? What might they be? We can talk about this in a moment, but I think they are European solidarity, friendship, engagement, defense against Russia. These kinds of big heart-type issues. People don't like what they see mostly around Russia's treatment. People understand increasingly that there is an issue not just for the Baltics or the Eastern Europe, but for us as well. And you can see that in all sorts of ways, not least, for example, whether we like it or not, in the willingness of countries, and including our own country, to increase defense spending, to support Ukraine. It's essentially a heart-type issue, which I think plays into the whole idea that to be European is an emotionally good thing. I think that what's happening in America plays into the same kind of heart-type issues, that we're worried, not because we know too much about what Trump would do. It plays into our heart that America might move in other directions, suggest that Russia should attack one or other of our countries. I think there's a heart issue around our UK kind of world reputation. I think the idea that we're not now regarded in the same kinds of ways as pragmatic, effective, keen on human rights, keen on democracy, influential in trouble spots. We're not regarded, the fact that we're not regarded like that, I think that is a heart issue that we need to hold on to and think about how that impacts our theory of change around the country. And then I think, quite apart from those big picture issues, and there are others I'm sure you'll come up with, are a series of what I might call pragmatic heart issues. These are the things that impact people in their ordinary lives. GDP doesn't. We've just had the classic, we're now in a technical recession. Actually, if you translate that into GDP per capita, because our population has risen, we've been in recession for 7 quarters, not 2 quarters. But that's not the way it's expressed. So here are 5 things that I think, to a greater or lesser extent, are heart issues in the sense that they impact different categories of people, and that this is important for our theory of change as we try to see who do we address and how. So here's the first one, Erasmus. So for students, there's a heart type of issue that is really important for us to kind of work. It's a heart type. Why shouldn't I go and study in Göttingen or in Amsterdam or in Berlin or whatever? Why shouldn't they be able to? That's a heart type. It's a pragmatic issue, but it's one that impacts particularly a student population. A second one is visa arrangements for musicians and artists and creatives who are now, it's almost impossible, as far as I understand it, to get a visa and all the practical stuff that goes with it to perform in a wider European context and vice versa. It's a heart issue for that wider group of people, and maybe others of us as well. I think, we were talking about it, I think for travellers and holidaymakers, the increasing fingerprinting, biometric, and all those things that are now having to happen as you cross over the European borders, for travellers and holidaymakers, that's a heart issue. It's an issue which just gets to me. Why should I stand in a queue so that my eyes can be scanned and my fingerprints can be taken and I pay €7 or whatever it is? I think that in a slightly different sense, for business, the heart issue, it may be also a financial issue, of course, a head issue in that sense, are the food safety, the regulatory and alignment thing, that as we move further along away from all the complexities of doing business, of selling stuff and importing stuff, that's in the end a heart issue, particularly where it touches environmental regulations and where it hits animal safety and food safety. These are all, I think, you can say they're pragmatic, but they're ones that hit each group of people in a way that gets to you, as it were. And I think that's what we're looking for when we think about theory of change and how we want to impact these different groups of people, what's going to get to them, as it were, about where we're headed. I was going to say at the end of it that this not for EU labelling, you know, this thing about Northern Ireland. So you can try and get your minds around the sort of oddity of it all. But as I understand it, if a product from England or from Britain goes into Northern Ireland and therefore potentially could be sold into the Republic and onwards, it now has to be labelled not for EU, not for sale in the EU. But you find it in our English supermarkets because it's easier for the companies not to have to label every last bit of product depending on where it might go to Northern Ireland or not. Maybe it's a heart issue. It's a sort of irritant issue, I suspect, or a puzzling issue that's around. So that's my sort of second point. Theory of change, fundamentally it's about heart, not head, things that get to people rather than trying to make them do some calculation about whether our GDP is slightly bigger or slightly smaller. What do you think? Yeah.
I'd like to make a couple of points. First of all, as a nation, we never actually voted to enter the EU.
True.
We voted to enter the Common Market, which is a trade organisation, not a government. I don't think we would ever have voted to go into a government, and we didn't last time, in 2016, 2017, whatever it was. The second point is, it's quite obvious that the people who voted in a majority leave are the people who have been ignored by London. It wasn't really a revolt against the EU, it was converted into that by some very clever rhetoric. So it was really a revolt against being ignored by London. Now, point for us, since the referendum, London has ignored them even more. They've now cancelled the top end of the HS2. There's this ridiculous scam going on in Teesside, which is just lying in the pockets of a Tory billionaire now, with public money. The provinces have no chance with the Conservative government and with this current organisation. Brexiteers don't give a monkey about people outside London unless they happen to be able to convince them to vote for them. Now that is a heart issue.
It is a heart issue. I think going back to 1973, could go back further to the earlier attempts. I think you're right in the sense that I think those were heart issues because I think there was a certain sense at that time, and I'm old enough to kind of remember it, that we were on the decline. The empire, Macmillan's work, the change a few years earlier, was going. And there was a sense in which actually we could be more ourselves as a country in the future if we were part of this thing. And although it was indeed the European Economic Community, not of course the EU, I don't think, obviously it's a debate about how many people thought of it as a political thing, but actually the politicians, people like myself and many of my generation absolutely understood it as a sea change in our, if you like, our political relationships, no longer looking outwards to empire and all of that, yes, Commonwealth and so on, but nevertheless, this particularly in then a Cold War context, the heart of the Cold War, this was actually a heart issue at that time, I think I'd argue. But I agree with you, of course, that it is a heart issue, that people feel that they are being ignored. We lost the Brexit debate largely, I think, because we didn't address enough the sense of the left behind, that phrase that was used. And that's still around today, so we have to pay attention to that as a heart issue.
No, we ignored the emotional issue entirely, actually. The question of, we shouldn't have left Europe, we should have led it. Yes. That was our opportunity. Yeah. And then we could have been great in a different role doing that. And
I think that's right. I mean, and indeed I have down on my notes, I mean, I don't know whether we can create it, but building on just exactly what you said, is there a heart issue that can be built on which says,
Europe needs us.
We can be at the heart, we can
Europe needs us.
Yeah, we can be part of this thing that's going on, which is so important for the world and for Europe. We can offer in our skills and our ability, that kind of
Yes,
not
that's it, yeah.
not the negatives, but the positives of what we can bring to this a huge enterprise, this vision of a Europe that is free and prosperous. What can we bring to it? That's a
To
heart.
save you from the Russians.
Well, yes, that's part of that thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Powerful
yeah.
message.
It is.
I think you're absolutely right about the heart issues. And you mentioned quite briefly environmental regulations, but I think that's an absolutely huge one.
Yeah.
You know, there are things like the state of our rivers, which people really feel as a heart issue and get very angry about. But I don't know how many of the people who are angry about the state of our rivers are thinking this is connected with Brexit.
No, precisely.
I mean, certainly for me, one of the big reasons for not wanting us to leave was exactly this. I feared that a lot of it was being driven by people who wanted to loosen these regulations that keep us safe in environmental ways and other ways. So I think, how do we actually help people
Understand.
to see that some of these things they actually do feel and actually are angry about are connected to Brexit?
Yes.
I think that link isn't made by that many people.
No, and it's the same with medicines.
But that's part of
the lack of medicines.
It is. But that's part
it's
of our. If that is part of our theory of change.
Yeah.
If people around the River Wye understood that the reason why the River Wye is getting worse is because, and if,
But again, that starts getting to try to the ordinary person on the street, to try and explain to them. I mean, it's complex. To explain to them exactly why all this is happening, isn't that easy, really? Is it?
It's not easy, but that's the point about a heart issue. You don't have to get into technical details about the issue. You have
But
to
how? I
find-
mean, you can't just say, "Oh, well, it's because of Brexit," because they would dismiss that.
No, you can't say, but you can start posing the questions.
So that's a
around-
negative thing. Because
Sorry?
Brexit is worse.
Well, you can
You see, that's a negative.
Yeah. No, I see. Yeah.
I would tend to turn it around the other way.
Because it would be better if we
Yes.
were back there.
Surely,
Yeah.
surely, I just want to interrupt on
Yeah.
that. Surely you can say, because of Brexit, this government has ditched a lot of environmental regulations, therefore you have a rotten river.
I'd
That's
go
a
around
hard
it.
issue and it puts it in one sentence.
Well, I'd go around it. I think I tried to find a way around the other way around, rather than saying simply it's all because of Brexit. Because our theory
We could
of
solve the
change-
problem by.
Yes,
Right.
Our theory
Yeah.
of change will say that people who voted leave of Brexit are not going to be convinced by that. We have to come at it if we want hearts to be changed, we have to come at it from a slightly different way than saying it's all about the stupid decision you Brexiters took back in 6 years ago. It doesn't work.
No.
So we have to come at it, find a way which says, our rivers are in a dreadful state, are they not? Who can disagree with that? What is it that might improve the state of our rivers and our beaches and all that? Well, maybe it is if we had better, stronger regulations. How might we get better, stronger regulations, and so on? You can see coming at it in that kind of way, rather than saying it's always bloody Brexit people who, in the decision we took. Think about this theory of change idea. What is it that shifts people's minds? And on the whole, it's not by telling them they made a stupid decision in the past. On the whole, none of us easily shift our perspectives. A minute because somebody tells me I'm an idiot. Sorry.
Following on from your point of we don't change our perspective easily, I appreciate what you're saying about head issues and heart issues. And within this room, we probably all agree with that, because we are here because we've thought about this and it means a lot to us. But getting back to the time of the referendum, a lot of the people that I've spoken to voted the way they did because they were influenced by a relative. And they didn't have a head issue or a heart issue. It was just what their brother said. And some of these that I've spoken to are thinking people that you're really surprised that they let their brother dictate how they should vote, but that's what happens.
It is, and we are all influenced by people who are close to us in one way or another. And if we think our brother or sister, knows more about these things than I'm likely to, then of course we do. You take seriously their views, but in a funny way, that's also a heart issue, isn't it? That although my brother or sister might have a head approach to it, the fact that I'm listening to them is almost a kind of heart issue. So I'm not saying there are no head issues, there are no need for analysis. Of course there absolutely is, and that's what our think tanks and our research outfits, the European movement, and all sorts of other bodies do. We need to be aware of those if we're going to engage in that. So I'm not suggesting that analysis is not important, it really is. But at the end of the day, how most people are persuaded, you have to look how politics is done these days. Look at our newspapers, our media, they don't deal in facts. They deal in slogans, they deal in those sort of things.
What about Bring Back Control? Those of us who saw the Benedict Cumberbatch film. I mean, he just put a little word in, if you believe in that, and then it turned the key to a load of nonsense because we were in control anyway.
There are lots of good examples. I mean, remember that, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
It was absolutely brilliant. Piece of hard stuff. It didn't go into lots of analysis. It was a video which kind of drew on our prejudices against, high-level business people, as whoever it was, the actor who played the chairman of the board. Remember that?
No, the UCHR one with Patrick Stewart.
Yes, that Patrick Stewart. That was the one. That was the chairman. So, okay, I'll move on to my, because I know I'm going on a bit.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
point actually is that you say that there's no analysis, but say in advertising, huge amounts of analysis go into creating simple emotional messages.
Yes.
And that's the point, you see. You've got a captive audience here who wanted to come and hear you. That's encouraged you to make 4 points.
Okay.
Now, but I don't think that anybody who is voting for Brexit or on the verge of change is going to listen to the and then argument. What I think you need is the punchy line, which says it all. Our rivers are a mess because we no longer have the regulation that we had before.
Totally agree with you, because take the supermarket points. They have done they have their theory of change. This is what changes the mind of Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so to buy this. They do their theory of change work. And then, out of that, come up with the slogans, the advertising. So it's, you're right, we don't go through all that process out there, but how we think that we're going to come up with the persuasive slogans, arguments, debate points, and so on.
You define each demographic, what their main fear or need is, and then you can develop the messages appropriately.
About the pollution of the rivers, I can't see that people think it's going to be better when we are in Europe. We can change the regulations in this country, isn't it? Obviously, they will say we need a different government, and I think many of the parties at the moment offering better solutions for the environment and regulations.
Well, I understand that. I mean, my hope, I guess we all secretly hope, don't we, that the reason why at the moment the Labour Party is being so coy about all these issues is because whether it's true we'll see, but we kind of hope that it's in order, that their theory of changes don't frighten people. And what we hope, I suppose, is if they get into power, they will have a different attitude. Whether that's true, I don't know. But I think that's what I kind of hope. I'm going to go on because we're going to run into closing time. So just a very quick one here. This one's just to say that the European movement has come up with quite a helpful little listing of 3 categories where we would all be looking for change but each of them requires less or more change in political consciousness. I'll give you some examples. So the first of these are things that, and this is important for the way we present ourselves and the sort of things we think. So the first of them is things that the UK can do unilaterally to change where we're at. So looking for those types of things that don't require any change to the Brexit agreements or any change by decisions by the European Union, things that this country could perfectly well change by itself if it wanted to. So you can have small things or you can have big things. So you can have things like work visa arrangements for workers coming in from the EU, professionals and so on. That's our own government's decision. It doesn't require any change to any of the agreements that were made post the TCA and all that. So thinking about what are the things that our government, on its own, whichever government it is, could, if they wished, change. Because that's quite an important category, isn't it? It says you don't have to admit that you got it wrong, you don't have to seek approval from the Commission or anything. That's one category. What are the things that we could change if we wanted to without any impact on any of the kinds of Brexity types of agreements that have been put in place? That's one category. We need to try and we can, I'm not going to go into all the details, I don't know all of them, but it's a category which says you can do this if you want to. And this is important for the Labour Party. When we get, as I hope, another government, we need to be saying to them, these are the things you could do without needing any approval from anybody else except the government. So things like rejoining the single market or the customs union or whatever, those are big things that would require changes from the EU and in all sorts of ways. But what are the things that we could change on our own account? And then the second thing, second category, are changes which wouldn't affect the Brexit deal, but would require some kind of acceptance by the EU. So, for example, the Erasmus scheme, if we wanted to shift from the Turing to the Erasmus scheme, we could do that. Government could do that if it wished to. It would have to have the okay from the European Union, but would almost certainly get it. It doesn't require a renegotiation of the Brexit treaties. That's the key issue here in this middle category. It may require their okay, which they would almost certainly give in the case of Erasmus, but it doesn't actually require a renegotiation of any of the treaties. Horizon is a really interesting example. So we stood out from Horizon. We said, no, we're not going to do it. And then we said, maybe there's something in it for us. So we will join Horizon. Didn't require a treaty change. But it did require, obviously, the Union to say yes, which they were very happy to do. Really interesting to reflect on what were the pressures that led our government to change their mind about joining Horizon, the great scientific research and funding thing. We need to do a bit more work on what brought that about. What were the key change factors that led was it the scientific community? Was it the money that was available? What was it? Because that gives us some indications about how other things that are within our power, our government's power, might lead to change. Ways to improve access for musicians, artists, creatives and so on. That's within our government's possibility, needing to agree with the EU, but doesn't require a treaty change.
There's a big, I'm going to come on to that later, there is a big campaign that the European movement are starting called Face the Music, and I will explain it later.
These are the kinds, so do you see these sorts of categories? Cooperation on medicines, on policing, on airlines, on industrial subsidies, all those kinds of things are within the power of our governments to come and say, we'd like to do this. It doesn't require a treaty change. So that's my middle category, the European movement's middle category. Very, very important, I think, in trying to, if we say, join the single market, join the customs union, we know that those are huge things, politically and in terms of negotiation with the European Union, free movement, free capital flows and so on. Important, and if we can get there, so much the better, but this middle category of things, I think, are also important. And then a third category, obviously, are those things that would need negotiation with the EU and might involve changes to the treaties, the withdrawal treaty. So extend the treaty to cover financial arrangements, so that leaving treaties didn't cover financial services. That's an important part of our economy. That's in the third category because it obviously requires major negotiations. So that's my sort of third and semi-last, you'll be glad to point. What are the issues in which of those categories are the ones that we want to focus our attention on as we speak to people and as we put out our own views? And it has to be, certainly the first of them, things that we can do if we want to, and then possibly some of the second things. But the third category, probably, it's not worth spending a lot of time on at the moment, hopefully one day. Does that make sense? There's a good analysis on the European Movement website about those three categories and the sorts of things that are within each other. Okay, last bit, deep breath. Can you cope with a little bit more? How are we doing? So, this is about what should we be doing. So here are some don'ts. Here are some things that we should not, in my view, be doing. We should not be saying, "I told you so, you idiots." It just doesn't work. We all know in our ordinary human experience, being told that you're an idiot for doing something just doesn't sit. Well, Tessa tells me quite often. So the second thing I think we shouldn't do is what I would think of as getting into contested debates where we're not going to win. Lots, particularly the economic stuff, we're not going to win because alternative facts are always going to be produced, or the old Project Fear. So don't get into arguments that you're just not going to win. There's no point. Just either back off or absorb it or just don't go there. Lots of those kinds of things. Thirdly, and this is a tricky one, and I don't know where anybody is in their political opinions or who they're going to vote for or anything, and I'm not implying anything, but it's really important that we are not what I might call anti-Tory. That's not going to win anybody over. I don't mean we shouldn't be ready to debate European issues, the sort of things we've been talking about tonight, with Conservatives, but we have to be, I think, quite careful not to elide political view as between a Labour or a Conservative or a Lib Dem or a Green or whatever it might be, to elide that with our European politics. We've got to be, in the context we're talking about, obviously in other contexts, how we vote is how we vote, how we engage in hustings and so on is how we engage. But what we're actually trying to do is irrespective of someone, even Mr. Nigel Farage. I would be quite glad to engage with him on European issues without saying I really detest your other political views. Do you see what I mean? That we've got to be quite careful, particularly as European movement, but more generally, how we frame the debates that we're having. And then I think my last one of don'ts is let's try not to get into a debate about the terms of rejoining. It's a futile debate. Will the European Union say this? Will we have to join the euro? Will we get our rebate? Will we this, that, or the other? There's not a lot of point in getting, because we don't know. There are no answers to that at the moment. If we get to the point when we apply to join, of course, those will be hugely important issues. I don't think those are issues that are worth getting into at all. Maybe amongst ourselves we can debate those things, but out there I just don't think that's a useful thing. So here are some do's. Pick on issues that people feel about. That's my heart thing. Theory of change is fundamentally about the heart. Unless you're a sort of policy wonk or a statistical expert or whatever, then do the analysis, but pick on the issues that people feel about. Secondly, be honest about what you might call unknowns and risks. Of course, I think that being part of the EU is the best prospect for us all. But I couldn't say that there are no downsides, no risks, no issues that are going to have to be confronted, whether it's the Orban or the AfD. Let's be honest and not just say that we're going to paint a picture which is all sunshine and brilliant about being in the EU. It's more complex. You don't have to look at what's going on in different European countries to see that it isn't all sunshine and wonder. So we need to be known as people who are honest and that we have arguments that are full of integrity, as it were, about the realities of the world. But we can do a lot more to highlight the good news coming out of the EU. We don't do enough of that. Without resiling on what I said about being honest and true of the difficulties, the green package that actually was adopted by the EU last year was a tremendous thing. Agreements around trying to control social media and the big Googles and all the rest was a really good news story. We're still struggling with that kind of stuff. So where there's good news, without pretending it solves everything the day after tomorrow, which comes out of the EU, what they're doing. Let's speak it. I think that encouraging European movement membership, that's an important do. So amongst people, our friends and so on, who might be more pro but who haven't joined up, we need European movement to be a mass movement. When the referendum was announced, I think I'm right in saying that the membership of the European movement was as low as about 5,000 people. 5,000 out of, 65, 70 million people. It's now substantially greater. I haven't got the exact figures.
22,000. It's about 22,300 odd.
But it needs to be 100,000. It needs to be a genuine mass movement.
The more members we have, the more we can campaign, the more influence we have. We can't campaign without funds. And the numbers of members is also important because it gives us more clout, more influence. So if you're not a member yet, it's only the cost of a cup of coffee a month. It's not huge to become a member. But it certainly makes a lot of difference to the numbers of staff that the European movement are now employing to do things, all the social media stuff and everything else is much greater than it was before. And they need maintaining. We need that stuff.
That's absolutely right. We need to be able to say that this is a mass movement. Movements are what changes things, not political parties in that sense, not lobby groups. Something that can genuinely claim to be a mass movement is what counts. Make local partnerships so that we're not just us. Where another organisation shares our views on the particular issue, whatever it is, make partnerships with the Greens around what we were talking about, environmental things, around, make votes matter. It's more tricky, but where we think that another organisation which has membership shares one or other aspect of our hopes and beliefs, make partnerships. And be careful, because we don't necessarily share all the views of everybody, but where we do, see what we can do to make partnerships. Keep the newsletter, Facebook, all these wonderful things that you, Jane, and others are doing, how we get ourselves out there, continuing to do that in this time of transition, of complexity, of when people are not terribly interested in being committed to something. It is difficult, but keeping going, ticking over, and just a touch more than ticking over if we can manage it, I think is really important, because there is a risk that in our present state, people just believe that nothing is worth committing to, time and energy, whereas this is absolutely worth committing to. And then lastly, 4 things during the election. We might have a little vote about when we think the election's going to come. Mine's on October, but we'll see. Might be May, who knows. So here are 4 things that I think are relevant. The first is get hold of the candidates, ask them questions, and publish their answers. There's some rather nice little questions that have been suggested in one quarter I saw. Do you agree that collaboration with the EU is critical in the face of Russian aggression, Chinese threats, and the risk of Donald Trump re-election? That's a heart-type question. See what they say. Do you agree that we should make trade deals only with countries that are making progress towards net zero? That's an EU policy. Interesting to see. No, couldn't care less about, says one candidate, about net zero. We should make trade deals with whomever we want. Well, that'd be interesting to publish that view. Will you support rejoining Erasmus? Good question. What do you feel about that and why? Would you support voting rights, slightly more controversially, for EU citizens with settled status, as Commonwealth citizens have in this country? So you can think up some really interesting heart-type questions. Don't require statistical answers. Are we better off or worse off? Get to the candidates, ask them, publish their answers. Attend hustings when they come. Always attend hustings and ask questions of that type. And ask for meetings with candidates. So we did, I think, have one with John Glenn back at the time. I think we had one with him, didn't we, Adrian?
We had several with John Glenn, and we also had one with all 4 main candidates.
Yes.
Brought a colleague of mine down from Kingston, if you remember.
I do, that's right. So those kinds of things. So when the election comes, think through what are the key things that we want to do. And then very lastly, the trade and cooperation agreements is up for review in 2025/26, so in a couple of years' time. And that's a review of all the arrangements that were entered into after Brexit. And so that will be an interesting time just to keep in our minds ahead about the sort of things the European movement and we ourselves might want to raise. We may have a different government by then. What's the context then? What are the sort of things that we would want to encourage governments to bring to that major first review of the Brexit agreements? Whew, there you are, done.
Thank you, Guy.
Well.